Decreasing rainfall and rising populations whilst maintaining a vibrant agricultural industry could heighten severe water shortages for California. California is no stranger to disasters such as persistent droughts and wildfires that's devastated the land. The state comprises 14% of the US economy, much of which is fueled by agriculture. The state's agricultural industry produces $50 billion in output. California supplies about 50% of the country's fruits, nuts and vegetables across almonds, apricots, avocados and many more grown foods. And California has an insatiable thirst for water. Dr. Jeffrey Mount is a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California Water Policy Center. Dr. Mount, or Jeffrey, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Glad to be here.
Can you tell us about your work with the Public Policy Institute of California?
So I am a senior fellow, and this Water Policy Center is part of a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank called the Public Policy Institute of California that does a lot of policy research. And my role is I'm a physical scientist, a geomorphologist of all things, who works closely with a variety of people, economists, biologists, engineers, to basically look at forward-looking solutions to California's challenges, water scarcity, which you laid out in your introduction.
California, like Australia, has problems with water. What are the main issues?
Well, we're very much like Australia, and it's strikingly so. The issue with California is it's a terrific place to grow crops. It's a terrific place to live. It's extraordinary industry. I mean, I remind you, we're the sixth largest economy in the world, so it's really quite a place. The problem is it has very unreliable water supplies, and this is no different than Australia, particularly the Murray-Darling Basin as an example. We are the most variable climate in North America in California, meaning when you look out over the course of each year, we have a drought, same way as you do in Australia. Where it stops raining here in May and doesn't start raining again if we're lucky until November. So we have an annual drought, and then we get these periodic droughts, like the extraordinary one we had 2012 to 2016, which wasn't as long as your millennium drought, but it was certainly as intense. So that's the nature of our climate. And there is no place in North America that's more variable than California. So you got it. I mean, unreliable water supply and an extraordinary economy.
We've heard Devin Nunes talk about this. Is it true that substantial excess water from snow melts and rivers, etc., still runs into the sea, which seems like a great waste and not really utilizing the water that you have?
Yeah, so my smirky smile is just to go. I hear this all the time. So let me back up and first put Devin Nunes in context. He represents an agricultural district in the San Joaquin Valley, which is always dealing with chronic water scarcity. And so that's a major challenge in his district. And when you're dealing with chronic water scarcity, you're often looking for scapegoats. And so there is a lot of scapegoating of the environment, or better yet, they'll pick a listed species, in this case, Delta smelt. We can talk more about that later. So there's a lot of scapegoating on that. But what the problem with political sloganeering is it has to take something, as everybody knows, is very complicated and nuanced. Management of water is not, there's no black and whites in water. The only black and white in water is there are no black and whites in water. So it's very complicated. And then you make it into a political slogan, and one that he and others from his area have used constantly is water is wasted to the sea. Well, I guess that's in the eye of the beholder, but to actually use water in this system, we have to let it go to the ocean. I'll give you a classic example, and maybe we'll talk more about this later. The hub of our water supply is in an estuary of all places. It's the estuary at the upper end of the San Francisco Bay, and it's called the Sacramento-San Joaquin Estuary, or Delta is what we call it. And it turns out that a lot of the water that Devin Nunes' district relies upon comes out of that estuary. It has to be pumped out of it. And if you don't let water go to the ocean, so-called wasted, that estuary gets salty. They have to keep water running through it, otherwise it gets too salty and you can't use it to grow your crops. So that's the first thing. The second is that since the 1920s, that agricultural region, the San Joaquin Valley in particular, which I will tell you is the most productive agricultural land maybe anywhere in the United States, they've been living beyond their means there since the 20s, long before the environment or concepts of water wasted to the sea began. And that is, they've been basically mining groundwater in that area. A lot of groundwater has been mined out of that area, and it's getting more and more expensive to deal with that because now your water tables are so far below the surface. So it's a nuanced answer. There is no doubt we could store more water and let water, not as much water, go to the sea. But there's two reasons we don't. One, it's California. It doesn't all come at once. It's nice if you get rain spread out over the course of the year, but frankly, we live on 5 to 7 big storms per year. That's our water supply. So we just don't have the facilities to capture it all. You have to let it go. That's the first problem. And then the second is we have a series of environmental laws that have been in place for the last 40 years, going on 50 years, which says that water in California is a public trust resource. It doesn't belong to anybody. And so all the facets that water supports have to be balanced. And whether it's for direct economic uses like growing crops, very high value crops on farms, or whether it's keeping a salmon fishery going, or it's just the ability for people to recreate within it or to use it for drinking water, we have to balance all of those. And what that means is not all the water can be captured and used for typical consumptive uses, economic uses such as farms.
What are some of the more serious issues that have emerged with groundwater use and its availability?
Yeah, and so in my earlier comment, I alluded to that. We were, for groundwater, this is different, very different than what a lot of places in Australia where your groundwater is kind of salty, so people don't actually want to use it. So that's why you work your surface water so directly. But let me give you context here in California. Roughly 30% of the supply of water in California, statewide, comes from groundwater, and the rest, 70%, comes from surface water. And so we've got we have one of the world's most complex storage and conveyance systems, which captures and controls that surface water, tries to get us through droughts, but we are really heavily dependent on groundwater to get us through the really tough times. So on an average year, about 30% of the supply comes from groundwater. After about 3 years, we've drawn our reservoirs down, and more of the agricultural community and the urban community has to turn to groundwater. And so in the height of a drought, just the drought we had just recently in particular, you're talking more than 60 to almost 65% of your supply comes from groundwater. Well, what's happened is over the years, we have just simply not been putting money back in the bank on the groundwater side. So we have been mining groundwater extensively, and particularly in the Central Valley and in these agricultural regions which are so productive in the state. And we have a crisis, a groundwater crisis, and for many reasons we have a groundwater crisis, not the least of which is just getting very, very expensive to pump it, and water quality is declining, and there's no easy replacement. And then on top of that, in the sort of classic tragedy of the commons, excess pumping of groundwater has caused an array of unintended consequences, not the least of which is extraordinary land subsidence. As the aquifers compact, as you pull the water out of them, the land subsides, and tens of feet in some areas as much as 50 feet over history. So this lowering of the land surface elevations starts to break up your infrastructure. It wrecks bridges, it wrecks roads, and then not ironically, tragically, it actually changes the very canal systems you're using to try and move water around. So you can't move as much water around because of the subsidence, which makes problems worse. So you can't get your surface water to these areas, and people are more reliant on groundwater. So we have been out of whack for a long time on this, and during this last drought, the 2012-2016 drought, when so many people had to turn to groundwater, it was it was clear we finally were going to have to rip the bandage off and try and solve this problem. So the state of California passed its most significant legislation in 100 years on the water. And basically it's called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And basically what we're doing is we're giving all the groundwater pumpers 20 years to come into balance in their basins and become sustainable. Frankly, most places, that's going to be demand management is going to be the bulk of that. They're going to have to reduce their water use. And that's going to be some big consequences.
What about technologies that can be used to solve groundwater problems? Anything that's floating around out there that just might help?
Well, floating is a metaphor. That's good. But so we are seeing an avalanche of technology coming in, and it comes in various forms. First, good groundwater management relies on good accounting. I mean, you have to know who's using how much. There are no laws here in California that you have to tell people how much groundwater you use. But basically with this new law, we're going to have accounting. So all kinds of technologies have started to appear to not only the numerical models that describe how groundwater moves and recharge of groundwater, but even using space-based instrumentation to estimate how much water people are using and what the overall consequences. So that's one form of technology that's coming in. And there is an extraordinary influx of technology in agriculture alone. As you know, we're becoming phenomenally efficient with the use of water. In fact, I will argue that area is the San Joaquin area where they're growing so much high-value crops. They are using technology like mad. My university, the University of California, Davis, is one of the leaders in developing that technology. And right out their back door is the place where it's being used extensively. But and then the monitoring, which is really amazing, the soil moisture monitoring, the very prescribed application of water and fertilizers. Technology is helping. However, just to be perfectly clear, technology is not creating water. It's just making more efficient use of water. And therein lies a problem that I want to highlight about technology here. For years, the federal government has put money into making farmers more efficient with the use of their water. Drip irrigation, small scale micro sprinklers, monitoring soil moisture. It's really terrific stuff. Here's the problem. The source of groundwater recharge in this rich agriculture region is not rain, it's irrigation. Because we move water such vast distances in California, it's basically taking water from wetter places and putting it into drier places, and over irrigation is recharging the groundwater. One of the consequences of more efficient use of water is that instead of farmers letting that water go back into the ground where it can be stored, they just plant more crops. And so the net use of water increases. So all this technology is great, but it doesn't create more water. And an unintended consequence is we actually use more.
Tell me this, where has policy development or implementation failed the most?
Well, I'm sorry to say that I can't choose one thing.
Many.
Well, I mean, and also these things are always they're always intertwined. You can't separate them. So to give you sort of quick background on that, today, at least the group that I work with, we think of water in four sectors. Urban, which is the economic engine of California. Agriculture, which is the economic engine of rural California. I do want to remind you, agriculture is about 2.5% of the GDP in California, but it uses 80% of the developed water. So I mean, it's the big water user because you need water as a throughput for that industry. So then we have there's a environmental justice, social justice issue that has really cropped up here in California, where there were historic policy failures. And these rural communities that when everybody started pumping groundwater like mad, they were left without water. They were left high and dry, whether it was a personal well or it was a small utility. They were left high and dry, or their groundwater quality was horrible. And then there's the last one, which has been probably the single greatest challenge, and it has not worked out well, is the environment. Remember, water is a public trust resource in California. It's managed for multiple objectives. And that and we struggle with that balance all the time. We are seeing what we could say is it's the beginning of quite a wave of extinctions here in California of a variety of freshwater organisms, both those that live in the river, along the river, and in wetlands. And this is just something we haven't worked out. We haven't achieved that balance. We haven't come up with something smart on that. So policy on the urban side, I think, has been pretty good. And the reason is the urbans have money. I mean, they've got a lot of money because they collect fees, and they can do it. So through droughts, we've noticed the urban. I mean, we're probably at the front end of a drought right now in California. We had an incredibly dry year last year, and we started out to another dry year. I can tell you, the LA basin, no problem. All their reservoirs are full. The joke in water in California is LA always gets its water. Why? Because they go out and steal it fair and square is the joke. I mean, they have the money. What was it? Water. Mark Reisner said, "Water flows uphill to money." So the urban areas, the big urban areas, have the capacity to do this. That, and they have pursued a diversification of their portfolio. I mean, when you think of a financial portfolio, what do they tell you? Be diverse. That is what they're doing in the urban areas. The agricultural areas, this has been a greater challenge, but we have now put in place this new policy, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which is going to be very painful for the agricultural world. I mean, when you think about there's going to be substantial fallowing of land. Hundreds of thousands of hectares will have to be fallowed in order to bring those basins into balance. And that's a major challenge. And although we put in place a policy which will drive it in that direction towards sustainability, we haven't got the backup policies that you need to get a soft landing for the agricultural community and the communities that surround them. I mean, there's great public interest in having that done with the least amount of social and economic disruption as we can. So we're still, I don't want to call it a policy failure. We're still working it out, that side. On the rural communities, we are still working that out. But as my late mother used to say, son, if money can solve it, it's not a problem. This is solvable with money in these communities. It's just to try and figure out the right mechanism, help from the federal government, help from the state, to get them reliable, clean water supplies, which we consider in California a human right. And then lastly, on the environment, we really need a reset on that. We're dealing with a now almost 50-year-old law, the Endangered Species Act, Federal Endangered Species Act, and the Matching Act on the state side, and the Federal Clean Water Act and the Matching Act on the state side. These creaky old acts haven't really been updated to understand and accommodate how changed these systems are. So that's probably the place where we've just been paralyzed on trying to come up with an alternative to the way we're doing it, which is using species which are teetering on the edge of extinction to really manage ecosystems, the entire environment. It was never the intention of the original act, and it's really kind of almost a perversion of the act when you think about it. So that's a place where we need some really big, broad, new thinking to try and deal with it, because, as I remind you, nobody owns water in California. You own a right to use it. You apply for a right to use it, but you don't own it. It is a public trust resource. So that part we're still struggling with. But I will tell you, the agricultural community in California is extraordinary. I mean, their productivity is through the roof, and of course, they have shifted very heavily. This is a scary thing. They've shifted very heavily to the perennial crops like almonds and pistachios and walnuts and some of the citrus fruits. So these perennial crops require reliable water supplies. You can fallow a tomato field, you can't fallow a pistachio orchard. And so, not without great economic cost. So that part we haven't quite got. So that's waiting to figure out how we deal with sort of reducing our water use through demand management, along with some increase in supply. But the laws of physics don't apply here. There's not abundant available new water in California. I mean, it's the same thing in the Murray-Darling Basin. That's an example of a basin that's pretty well tapped out. So it's not like you're going to make a lot of new water in that basin. We got the same problem here in California.
Water, very political. Last 4 years under the Trump administration, the next 4 with Biden-Harris. Much of a difference with regards to water in one, California, and then 2, rural California?
Yeah, boy, it has been an interesting last 4 years.
Good or bad? Good or bad?
Well, see, that's what I want to say is that we've held several conferences in my own. I mean, we're a nonpartisan shop. We tried very hard to stay out of Republican versus Democratic politics, really to sort of focus on the resolution of the issues. And there were some really good things and some really bad things that happened in the last 4 years. So you can't just say it was all bad or it was all good. A lot of it depends on your political point of view. There was a very strong effort on the part of the Trump administration to increase the amount of water that goes to agriculture in California. It was very divisive, and in fact, it divided the state and the federal government, and they, in fact, are suing each other. Well, actually, in this case, the state is suing the federal government over their own actions, which is incredibly counterproductive. But the fact of the matter is, water in California. By the way, Mark Twain did not say whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. He should have. I mean, it's logical to assume that he would have said such a thing. But the issue that we're facing here is there is not a good relationship between California and the federal government. And the federal government operates a very, very large water project here called the Central Valley Project, which runs in parallel and in cooperation with one that's run by the state, so the State Water Project. And these projects move water vast distances. So it's really important to get along with the federal government here. If there's one thing I can hope for with the change from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, it might be less of an adversarial process with the federal government. That said, it used to be that the federal government would come in on horses or tractors and come to the rescue in the West. I mean, that's the Reclamation Act is now more than 115 years old. This great federal act which put massive amounts of federal dollars into water projects and to spur economic development. Well, California hardly needs any more economic development funds from the federal government. We just need a better job of managing what we've got. And frankly, in the last 30 years, actually, ever since Ronald Reagan, this is a great example. A former governor from California. Federal investment, it hasn't dried up, but it's shrunk to a very small amount. I mean, federal investments today in water account for in a good year, 5% of investments in water infrastructure, supplies, and all the rest. So the federal government's a small financial player now in water in California, and I don't see that changing. No matter how much you get along with the federal government, I don't see massive amounts of money coming into California to fix stuff, to fix broken infrastructure. So it's a fair question. We used to think that there was going to be a big change between the Bush administration and the Obama administration in California. And it turns out in the end it wasn't. California really is in charge of its own water, mostly. The federal government is important. It's important, but really it's our own politics rule the day in water in California.
Interesting times ahead. I've used this comment a few times. The Chinese said, "May you live an interesting life." We certainly are. It'd be nice if it would just calm down, just simmer down just a bit. But interesting. I mean, without water, we're all, as we'd say in Australia, without water, we're stuffed. So another great Australian saying.
Here in the States.
Yep.
That's right.
Yep. Look, a real pleasure chatting. Got to do this again, because there's so many issues, and it's impossible to talk about all the issues in the time we have. Dr. Jeffrey Mount, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
The Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta is California's greatest water management challenge. The delta lies at the eastern end of the San Francisco Bay. Its waters are brackish on the western edge, where the tides push salt water in and out. Its waters are fresh further inland, where the flows of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers merge. Since the mid-19th century, the delta has been utterly transformed. Following the gold rush, farmers drained the roughly 700,000 acres of marsh that made up the delta. They constructed more than 1,000 miles of levees, creating dozens of islands of farmland. Over time, farming has caused these lands to sink. Many delta islands now lie more than 15 feet below sea level. The delta was further changed by the extensive use of its waters. 1/3 of runoff from the delta watershed is used upstream, principally for farms. And two of the largest water projects in California, the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project, export roughly 1/5 of the delta's waters to more than 25 million people and 3 million acres of farmland in the Bay Area, the San Joaquin Valley, and Southern California.
Water supplies from the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta are declining. The quality of this water is protected today by a system of levees that hold back salt from San Francisco Bay. As the sea level continues to rise, land level continues to sink, and we have earthquakes in this part of the world, this system is a grave risk. Fixing this will be expensive. Not fixing it will also be expensive because we'll have much less water for the people of California.
Managing the waters of the delta is complicated by changes to the ecosystem. There are dozens of native plants and animals that make this place home or pass through as part of their migration. Many of them are now threatened with extinction. This includes the delta smelt, salmon, sturgeon, steelhead trout. And the sources of stress to these fishes are many. This changes the flow regime, transformations of habitat within the delta and upstream of the delta, the presence of invasive species, and now a changing climate. Thus, any fix is going to require that we address the problems facing fish and other wildlife that depend on it.
In 2009, the legislature passed the Delta Reform Act. This law calls for the delta to be managed for two co-equal goals: improved water supply reliability and ecosystem health, while also protecting the delta as a unique and evolving place. Several large, complex, and highly controversial planning efforts are underway to address these goals. This includes a proposal to replumb the delta, using tunnels to move water from the Sacramento River to Central Valley Project and State Water Project pumps in the South Delta. All of these efforts are fraught with uncertainty, but California needs to move beyond planning and begin addressing the delta's many challenges.